Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to the Drilldown, where we relentlessly expose cronyism, corruption, and the abuse of power in Washington, D.C. My co-host, as always, Eric Eggers. Eric, how are you?
I'm excellent, Peter. It's a big week. It's election week here.
It is. It is a big week. It's election week, and we're going to talk about a very interesting poll that everybody's been talking about. The New York Times came out with a poll on a presidential election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden and indicated that Donald Trump is leading in swing states.
There is really good news for the former president as well. There's this new New York Times Siena College poll. It shows Trump beating Biden in 5 out of 6 battleground states, beating him. And these, one of them is by 10 points. I mean, these are big margins.
Here in the latest New York Times Siena College survey, Donald Trump leads President Joe Biden in 5 of 6 battleground states won by then-candidate Biden in the last election. The only battleground state Biden would retain, according to this poll, is Wisconsin.
And everybody's talking about that top line of the poll, but as we always do, we dig deeper, and there are some startling results from that poll that are indicative of where we think things are going, and we're going to talk about that today. You will not have heard this anywhere else.
That's true. We got actual little bit of news to break, some stuff that people overlooked. And when we say it's election week, what we mean is it's 1 year before the next election for the 2024 presidency, and there are different states that are holding elections right now, and it's always interesting to think about the idea of having an election in this post-January 6th, post-Donald Trump's been indicted on charge of trying to steal an election environment. And that's actually the top line from this New York Times poll that we want to get into because it dominated the Sunday shows. Everybody's freaking out. And by everybody, of course, I mean Democrats who will hide under a table at the idea of Donald Trump resuming the presidency. 6 key swing states were polled, right, in this New York Times poll: Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nevada. And they're asked, do they support Joe Biden or Donald Trump? And Donald Trump's actually leading in 5 of those states. Only Wisconsin does Joe Biden have a lead. And so that's like everyone's kind of upset. But you think that that's maybe not the biggest news from this poll.
No, there's not. In fact, there's some very, very interesting stuff in the poll we're going to get into that nobody else is talking about. This is the same New York Times poll, and it's by looking at the crosstabs, some of the below-the-surface numbers.
I love that term because it sounds so complicated.
Crosstab.
It's like you have to click a different button.
Yeah,
and it's this hidden information.
It's kind of like, if you're sitting there and your daughter's car's not working, you're like, oh, it's the crosstab. We got to fix the crosstab.
I know.
It sounds like a technical term.
It's another thing I can't find.
Exactly. But the crosstabs offer some really startling data in a couple of areas, and we're going to talk about that today. The first one is with regards to the aggressive legal action against Donald Trump. We think it's politically motivated. I think the evidence shows it's politically motivated. But the crosstabs show that for the Democrats, this appears to be a winning strategy. And we're going to talk about that and why this is so important and why the prosecution of Donald Trump could actually decide this election in ways that other people didn't imagine. The second thing is by looking at the crosstabs, this was really kind of stunning to us, even though we are in this area all the time. The crosstabs indicate that those swing states where Joe Biden is now losing to Donald Trump, one of the key issues is
whether or not the voters believe he personally profited off of Hunter Biden's business deals with Ukraine and China. So let's just start there, right?
Yeah, okay.
So Donald Trump is leading in 5 of these 6 states, and he's leading by 10 points in Nevada, 6 points in Georgia, 5 in Arizona and Michigan, and then 4 in Pennsylvania. And as we said, Biden's up by 2 in Wisconsin. But if you look at whether or not when the voters were asked, do you think Joe Biden personally profited from his son's business dealings in China and Ukraine, right? There's a difference of 27% of people, more people in Arizona think yes, he personally profited than didn't, right? In Georgia, it's 11%. In Michigan, it's 11%. In Nevada, it's 15%. And in Pennsylvania, it's 16%. So double-digit margin in terms of voters in those swing states who think Joe Biden personally profited off of his son's business deals.
Yeah.
And those are the states that Trump's winning.
Yeah, exactly. Those are the swing states. So among all registered voters, they ask, did you believe, to the best of your knowledge, do you think Joe Biden personally profited from his son's business dealings in Ukraine and China? Yes, 50% of all registered voters said yet. Only 35% no, they
in those
did not.
6 states.
And by the way, more information is going to come out. So that 35% that say no is not going to go up. It's going to continue to go down. And the number of people who say that he profited goes up. But then you look at those swing states. Arizona, 56% say that yes, he personally profited. Georgia, 49%. Michigan, 46%. Nevada, 48%. Pennsylvania, 53% say that he personally profited. Wisconsin, 46%. In every one of those states, the slimmest margin is 5 percentage points in Wisconsin. The greatest margin is in Arizona, where it's 56% said he profited, and only 29% said he did not. These are devastating numbers, and it shows, I think, what we have believed all along at GAI, which is the American people care about this stuff. Well, it's important to them. They want to know if their political leaders are taking money and engaged in corruption, and it's going to affect them at the polls eventually.
Put it this way, the only state in the New York Times poll that everyone's freaking out about that Joe Biden is winning is the only state in which there's a much smaller percentage of people in terms of the yes-no tab that think he personally profited, right? So only 5% more people think he did that didn't.
In Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, every other state, it's double digits, and in every other state, Donald Trump's winning.
Yeah.
And so, but the idea of across those 6 states, 50% think that, yes, he personally profited. And here's, to me, why it matters. And this is important to consider because, this like, hey, what did Donald Trump do in Georgia? And, he got charged, and a bunch of people were charged with this RICO in Georgia back in August, and so you've seen people take plea deals, including his lawyer, and so it's this really weird environment in which the leading candidate for president as a Republican is also in charge, is accused of stealing, trying to steal the last election. But remember this, like more than half of the voters in these states said, yeah, I think he personally profited. That's information they didn't have access to 4 years ago.
It was suppressed. And we also didn't have the subpoenas that Congress had issued in this case. And again, this information is cumulative. The case becomes more damning the more that's released. Remember, before we didn't know if Joe Biden personally got money. We now know that he got at least $250,000, and that number's going to climb. We know more of the sources of that number. So this, I think, is the headline that people are missing in this poll. That what is driving this, yes, people are concerned about the economy, about inflation. They're concerned about the situation in the world, but corruption still matters. And this is having a very deleterious effect that is going to damage them. And by the way, it's not something you can easily reverse. Let's say inflation goes down and the economy gets better. Biden can claim that he was somehow responsible for that. This problem is not going to go away.
This problem won't go away. And you just said something I think we know, but many listeners or viewers of this podcast may not know, which is the $250,000. What do you mean by that specifically?
Yeah, so the latest revelations from the House Oversight Committee is that CEFC, the Chinese energy company, wired money to Hunter Biden. He then wired money to his uncle, and then his uncle wired it to Joe Biden.
That's a proven fact.
Yes. This is Jim Biden emailing the money, or sending a check to his brother Joe Biden, and 2 checks for a total of $250,000. And I think that's just the beginning. I think we're going to see more of this money flow to Joe Biden.
Here's a real quick question. I mean this sincerely. When James Biden, who's not young, sends a check, a 6-figure check to Joe Biden, or a 5-figure check, there's a check for $200,000 and a check for $50,000. Do you think he includes like a newspaper article he cut out? It's like, hey, I saw this, thought you'd like it, or man, they're really hammering you on this one.
It's really, really old school, and I hate to admit, I'm one of those people that still writes checks too. So me and Jim Biden,
money. There's a newspaper or like a cartoon that's in that envelope that you're like, look at this, a check and Garfield.
I haven't heard from Jim in ages.
But so the point is that we now know that there is a direct money trail between Hunter Biden's business dealings to Hunter, to Jim, and then to Joe Biden. So did he personally profit? He got money from it, right? And so unless it was a loan that he'd, maybe they want to like lawyer the language on it, but there's money that's coming from Hunter's business associates to Joe Biden directly. And so as the more that gets amplified, then I think you'll find that this correlation, which this New York Times poll suggests, which is the more people believe that Joe Biden personally profited from Hunter's businesses, the less likely they are to vote for Joe Biden, and the more likely they are to support Donald Trump. Like, the more that gets elevated then, the more it matters politically to Donald Trump. But the opposite's true also as it relates to these election charges.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Before we get to that, let's also remember that Comer's announced that he is going to he's going to subpoena about a dozen people to appear before the committee. That includes Hunter Biden, Jim Biden, and even floated the idea that he might subpoena Joe Biden. So there is undoubtedly more to come. But you're right. The second big revelation in this poll that no one is talking about is what happens if Donald Trump is convicted by one of these court cases. You've got the case in New York. You've got the case in Georgia. You got the federal case in Washington. And when you look at these same poll numbers, if the polls are believed, this indicates that this strategy, this kamikaze illegal strategy that the Democrats are engaged in prosecuting their political opponent, may actually work based on the poll numbers. What do the polls say?
So the polls say, again, so one of the questions was, what comes closer to your view about Donald Trump's actions after the 2020 election? And between the 6 states on aggregate, 42% said he was just exercising his right to contest the election. And 51% said he went so far that he threatened American democracy. So now that's obviously an idea that's being reinforced by the fact that he's been charged with the American legal system. And so, presumably you don't charge somebody with a crime unless you think they've actually committed a crime. So just as the more that the Hunter Biden, Joe Biden business dealings are elevated, it's penetrating and resonating with the American voter. So too is the idea that Donald Trump undermined democracy. Here's where it ultimately comes down to. The question is if Donald Trump were convicted and sentenced to prison, but were still the Republican nominee, would you vote for him? Okay.
Right.
Now, in these same 6 states, remember.
And by the way, these are people who were not voting for Joe Biden earlier.
Well, but look at what happens on the aggregate, right? So if we look at that bottom line number here, the aggregate number, big picture, as it stands right now, Donald Trump's up in 5 of these 6 states. But based on the conditional, again, the New York Times crosstab says if Donald Trump is convicted but still remains the Republican nominee, who are you voting for? Joe Biden is the leader in all 6 of those states.
It is.
So while you might say, hey, we're protecting American democracy by trying to prevent people like Donald Trump from, trying to steal it as he allegedly did after the 2020 election, what you might also say is actually you're undermining American democracy by putting these charges against him, which are proven to matter politically.
Yeah, you're swinging massive amounts of votes. And I think a lot of Republicans and a lot of people on Trump's team who want to pretend like, oh, this is not going to affect me. They're not being honest with themselves and they're not looking at the poll numbers. This is going to persuade voters. So they need to come up with a strategy to look at this in a clear way and further explain to people from their perspective of what's actually going on.
Well, no, by the way, here's some more context, right? So we're talking about Georgia specifically. So what did Georgia do? Georgia these are both Georgia. Georgia says, no, the 2020 election was safe and secure and it absolutely wasn't stolen, Donald Trump. You're crazy. And because it was run by 2 Republicans, right? Brian Kemp, who used to be Secretary of State, and the current Secretary of State that said, no, we did a good job. Also Georgia, after the 2020 election. Okay, we need to radically overhaul some of our election integrity measures. We're going to change the laws to prevent a lot of the stuff that happened from happening again. We're no longer going to have unsupervised drop boxes. We're going to have, all the time security anytime we're allowing ballots to be dropped off. We're not going to allow people to be standing next to voters as they cast ballots. And the backlash was so bad. It said, oh, you're trying to keep black people from having water. They said, no, you can have water. You just can't have anything with like political propaganda on it within 500 feet of a polling place, which has always been the law. Yeah. And so, but in COVID, it's like, hand out a dang Biden mask because we're saving people, know? And so they said, we're not going to do that anymore. The backlash was so bad. People forget this. Major League Baseball pulled the All-Star game. Delta, was pressured to try to move their corporate headquarters. I mean, it was bad in Georgia because they passed reforms in a reaction to 2020. So I guess which one is it, Georgia? Right? Is it the election was questionable enough that you needed to pass reforms, or no, it was super safe and Donald Trump's a crook?
Yeah, and so let's look at the numbers in Georgia. So this New York Times poll that everybody's looking to shows that Trump leads by 6 points in Georgia. The same poll shows that if Donald Trump is convicted and sentenced in the election, that same number in Georgia now swings to a 12% advantage for Joe Biden in Georgia, according to the same poll. Now, we don't know if these polls are accurate. Find out that people who voted for Trump before in that first poll, now that if he's convicted, 6% of them are now actually going to vote for Joe Biden, and a bunch of others are not going to vote at all. So Georgia, it applies in all the other states. So this is a real factor, a real thing, and to dismiss it as, oh, this is kind of a sideshow, it's not something to worry about, it is fundamental, and it is going to swing a huge number of votes. And here's the problem. Think about this. They're trying to rush these cases forward because they know, in fact, that it is going to affect the election. Let's say they rush them through, they ram them through, they get these juries that are in, highly Democratic districts.
Like Atlanta.
Yeah, like Atlanta, like Washington, D.C. They get a conviction. It's going to take time to appeal that. A judge may come along later and say this was a sham. By then, it's going to be too late. It's kind of like this suppression in 2020 of the Hunter Biden laptop. Once you kind of figure out what's going on and try to repair it or fix it or explain to people how unjust this was, it's too late because the election's already done.
So how do you reconcile the two findings, or two of the findings from this poll? On the one hand, Trump's up in all these 6 states. And people know, he's been charged not just in Georgia. I think he's been indicted 4 times in different courts around the country. So yet, despite that, he's up in 5 of these 6 swing states by a decent margin. At the same time, people are like, well, if he's convicted, then I wouldn't vote for him.
Well, I think it's, to me, and it's obviously speculation on my part, I think the reason he's up in these polls is people are frustrated and angry about the state of the economy, inflation primarily, and that is really, a lot of it is about Joe Biden and how Joe Biden has been spending all this money. That's inflationary. I think the other problem is you look at the world. The world's on fire. China may be moving into Taiwan. You've got the situation in Israel. You've got Ukraine. You've got American soldiers people taking pot shots at them all throughout the Middle East. The Biden administration is not doing anything. And of course, you have, as we talked about earlier, the whole problem of corruption. I think the American people are concerned and wonder if Donald Trump is actually convicted, how is he going to be able to do the job? Now, we know that he's going to appeal. It's not like they're going to put him in the clinker somewhere, unjustly. He's going to have the opportunity to appeal, but I think there's a lot of confusion about that. So that needs to be clarified, and I think we need to have the larger conversation now about how these kinds of situations are handled, because I can guarantee you they are going to push like crazy to get these trials done and get convictions before November, because they're aware of these poll numbers, even though the Sunday shows weren't talking about them.
I'm going to suggest an alternative hypothesis. And by the way, I just want to point out that your vocabulary is not just the world. Your vocabulary has also been on fire today, right? We're talking about crosstab, deleterious, and he just dropped a clinker, guys. And I'm telling you, all the times I've been doing podcasts.
That's an old man word, isn't it? The clinker.
But I think, what I would suggest is I don't know that as much of a swing will happen if Donald Trump is actually convicted. I wonder if it's also maybe like you're on the phone with these polling people, and there's some people like, well, then if he's convicted, are you still going to vote for him? Like, oh, no, absolutely not. But, the polling place is a private thing.
No, that's a great point. I mean, sometimes people in polls don't want to admit to somebody on the phone, like, hell yes, I'm still voting for him.
Damn right.
So that could be a factor. But there is, in my mind, no question that this is election interference, not only in trying to distract Trump's attention, not only trying to drain financial resources with all these legal actions, but I think that Democrats know, and these people know, that it does actually influence swing voters in the middle, because what's giving Trump these leads in these swing states are swing voters.
Well, and I think it also puts the media coverage of both stories, the Biden family corruption and Trump's legal challenges, specifically as it relates to the 2020 election, into an important context, because you're not just reporting the news. By reporting the news, you're actually shaping the political landscape and shaping the election, because if there's one takeaway, people think Biden's corruption matters, and so much so that it seems to be impacting votes.
That's exactly
People
right.
also think the idea that Donald Trump might be arrested or might be convicted matters and might be shaping votes as well.
Yep.
And so which do you cover more? Because the more coverage, conceptually, the more impact it has politically.
Yeah, and look, this is what we always say: corruption has consequences. People get very cynical these days, and they say, "Oh, they're all corrupt. Why does it matter?" It does matter, and I think these numbers indicate that corruption involving political figures, corruption involving the judicial system, does matter. It does swing votes. It does affect the future of our country, and it does shape policy. So it's something that we're going to continue to monitor and watch.
Do you think it's intentional? Last question. That the fact that there's clear, it says, I mean, in these states, in every state, a majority of people in these swing states think that Joe Biden personally profited from Hunter Biden's business deals. It's plain as day. It's in the poll for anybody to see in the crosstab, yet it hasn't been reported. Do you think that's intentional?
Yeah, I do think it's intentional. I think the mainstream media continues. If you read the Washington Post and the New York Times, and a decreasing number of people do, and I think those are connected, by the way. People don't think they're getting straight news. You don't even know that this is going on. So you look at some of the states like Wisconsin and you think, that's probably because the local media in Wisconsin is not picking up this stuff either. But at the end of the day, information and truth has a way of bubbling up.
It certainly does on this podcast.
And you can't suppress it. And that's why we have been pounding this story for years. You've now got congressional committees looking into it. You've got an independent counsel looking into it. And it is going to affect the way that people look at our national leaders. And I think it should. It should always be part of the conversation.
Not only should it, it is. And I think that's the big takeaway from the polling data.
Exactly right. Well, you've joined us for another episode of The Drill Down. We appreciate it always. We know your time is valuable. You can find information on our podcast and our research at thedrilldown.com, and you can find the podcast wherever great podcasts are located. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time.